Imagine navigating the streets of London using literally nothing but a map of the subway lines.
Right, you'd find the train stations, but that's about it.
Exactly. I mean, you would know exactly how to get from Piccadilly Circus to Covent Garden, but you would be totally blind to, the centuries-old architecture or the unpredictable flow of traffic.
Or the smell of the street food vendors, the actual pulse of the people living their lives.
Yeah, you'd be living in this simplified, color-coded schematic, not a living, breathing city.
And while obviously no one in their right mind would confuse a piece of paper with an actual metropolis, we actually do something incredibly similar every single day. We do it with our own minds, our relationships, and really our entire understanding of the universe.
Which is just such a wild realization. And for this deep dive, we have pulled together some incredibly rich sources. We are looking at a really dense, fascinating philosophical manuscript on cognitive mapping, alongside a few deeply researched case studies in behavioral psychology.
It's a fantastic mix of theory and practical reality.
It really is. And our mission today is pretty ambitious. We are exploring how we actively map reality, why we constantly trap ourselves in our own mental models, and how to finally break free from honestly, the crushing weight of information overload.
Yeah, the premise linking all these sources really fundamentally challenges how we interact with information. The central idea here is that any system we use to understand the world is strictly a mapping tool. It is never reality itself.
Right.
So whether we are talking about psychology, physics, biology, economics, or even something like astrology, these are simply maps. They are not the territory.
Okay, let's unpack this because I think most of us naturally assume that when we learn a new, say, scientific framework or a personality model, we are getting closer to absolute truth.
Yeah, but that assumption is precisely where the distortion begins. The philosophical manuscript we are pulling from doesn't claim these systems are false or inherently bad.
But they just have limits.
Exactly. The fundamental flaw is baked into how systems have to function by design. Total reality is an infinite, continuous stream of data. If the human brain tries to take in everything at once, it processes nothing. It just gets completely overwhelmed.
Staring directly into the sun, it's just blinding noise.
100%. To make reality readable to the human mind, a system has to select specific, isolated patterns and basically filter out the rest. Because it filters things out, it is incomplete by design.
Right.
This doesn't make the system a lie. It simply makes it a partial view. The fundamental mistake we make is mistaking that partial, filtered slice of reality for the absolute whole. We grab onto a fragment and treat it as the totality of existence.
But wait, I want to push back on this slightly. I can easily see how a corporate personality test is just a generalized map of human behavior, but is the source actually saying our hard empirical sciences are fundamentally flawed in this exact same way? Because that feels like a massive leap.
Well, it's a leap that the scientific community itself acknowledges. The manuscript is very explicit about this applying directly to the hard sciences. Not to call them flawed, but to highlight their strict domain-specific limitations.
Okay, give me an example.
Look at physics. Classical mechanics is a brilliant, highly functional model. It tells you with incredible accuracy how a baseball moves through the air or how a bridge supports weight.
It maps the macro physical world.
Right. But the moment you try to treat classical mechanics as a universal truth and apply it to the subatomic level, the model completely breaks down. It just fails.
Because it's out of its jurisdiction.
Exactly. You suddenly need quantum mechanics to explain the behavior of electrons. Reality requires multiple overlapping frameworks because no single model of physics captures the entire territory.
So the framework isn't broken. We just have a terrible habit of dragging a framework out of its useful zone and demanding it explain the rest of the universe.
Yes. And that habit creates massive blind spots in other fields too, like biology. The research points out that you cannot understand a living organism through just one biological system.
Interesting.
If a researcher only looks at an organism's genetics, or they only study its environment, or solely focus on its microbiome, they are completely missing the reality of the organism. Life doesn't exist as isolated variables in a vacuum.
It emerges from the interdependent, messy processes of all those systems interacting at once.
Precisely.
Which means, like, if a doctor is completely rigidly devoted to just a genetic map, they might totally overlook the environmental toxin that's actually causing a patient's illness. They mistook their specialized map for the patient's total biological reality.
And that phenomenon repeats literally everywhere. In psychology, reducing a complex breathing human being to a single clinical diagnosis or some trendy archetype completely ignores the dynamic, shifting totality of their internal state.
Mm.
The text even points to ecology to show how dangerous this map-making habit can be on a macro scale. Ecological systems thrive on cycles of growth, decay, rest, and renewal.
Oh, I see where this is going. If a society builds an economic or cultural model that only values one phase of that cycle, like demanding endless, infinite expansion and growth, it's completely ignoring the decay and rest phases that the actual physical territory requires to survive.
Leading to inevitable collapse, yeah.
Yeah.
The map of endless growth just doesn't match the reality of a finite planet. The manuscript also uses astrology as a prime example of this trap, which actually offers a really great perspective on how we distort complex systems.
I actually found the astrology section of our sources so revealing because it shows the sheer scale of how much we simplify things. Usually someone learns their sun sign, reads a horoscope, and says, well, I'm a Leo, and that explains why I'm acting this way today.
Right, which
Yeah.
is just a massive reduction. The astrological model, in its true historical depth, is effectively infinite in its relational complexity. A single placement, like a sun or moon sign, might correlate to a real behavioral tendency, so the map has a degree of validity.
Sure.
But isolating that one placement is like looking at a single brick and claiming you understand the entire cathedral.
Yeah, the sources list out the actual architecture of that system, and it is staggering. It's not just the 12 signs. You are dealing with planets, the 12 houses, the mathematical aspects between them.
Transits, progressions, composite charts for relationships.
Yes, asteroids, harmonic charts, and all these higher order symbolic mappings.
When you look at the sheer mathematics of that web, you realize how absurd it is to isolate one tiny data point and treat it as a definitive, unyielding statement about a human soul. Doing so creates a massive distortion.
It's wildly incomplete.
Exactly. The single data point isn't necessarily a lie, but it is wildly, dangerously incomplete when you disconnect it from the whole.
So if all these completely disparate fields, from quantum physics to macroecology, from clinical psychology to astrology, if they all suffer from this exact same cognitive trap, there has to be a mechanical flaw in how our brains are actually processing information.
There is. The manuscript identifies a universal underlying structure that all systems follow in the human mind. It basically happens in 4 sequential steps.
Okay, let's hear them.
First is mapping. That's where our brain selects specific patterns from the chaotic noise of reality.
Right.
Second is focusing. We bring our human awareness to that specific subset of patterns. Third is interpreting. We assign a defined meaning to what we are focusing on. And the fourth step is integrating. This is where we are supposed to relate that interpreted meaning back to the massive whole of reality.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The text points out that the grand failure point isn't the system itself. The failure happens at that 4th step. We fail to integrate the meaning back into the whole because we over-identify with the map we just drew.
We get stuck on step 3.
Exactly. Let's ground this. Let's walk through those 4 steps in a real everyday scenario. Say I am scrolling through a news feed.
A perfect modern example.
Okay, so step 1, mapping. Out of all the events happening on the planet today, my feed selects one specific pattern, a highly polarizing political headline. Step 2, focusing. I give my absolute attention to that specific conflict, ignoring the room I'm sitting in, ignoring the weather, ignoring my own breathing.
Your awareness narrows.
Right. Step 3, interpreting. I assign meaning to the headline. I decide, this means society is fundamentally broken and everyone hates each other.
And then comes step 4, integration. Ideally, you would take that interpretation and place it back into the context of the whole world.
Yeah.
You would remember that this headline is just one event happening alongside millions of acts of kindness, routine daily life, and normal human interaction. You would integrate the map into the wider territory.
But I don't do that. I totally fail at step 4. I take my interpretation that society is collapsing, and I treat it as the absolute defining reality of the world. My focus hardens into an identity.
This is rooted in the very nature of human focus. Attention is selective by definition. To focus on the news headline naturally requires you to actively blind yourself to the rest of your environment.
You literally have to tune out the sound of the refrigerator humming or the feeling of the chair beneath you just to read the text.
Exactly. It's the illusion of separation.
Yeah.
And we have to be clear here. This separation isn't inherently evil. It is cognitively necessary. If we didn't slice reality into manageable pieces, we couldn't function. We couldn't learn, communicate, or build anything.
But the danger the text warns about is when that temporary functional focus hardens into a permanent identity.
That's the trap.
We internalize the fragment, we start manifesting thoughts like, I am just an anxious person, or this single political ideology explains the entire moral universe, or this behavioral diagnosis defines my child's entire future.
When focus becomes identity, you completely forget that you were holding a subway map, and you start fighting people who tell you there are trees and buildings above ground.
That is such a good way to put it. This brings up a massive issue, though. If our focus naturally fragments reality, and we run this constant risk of turning those fragments into rigid identities, what is actually happening inside our minds when we lose the big picture?
The behavioral psychology case studies in our sources provide a really great lens for this. They introduce this concept of density, or internal fragmentation.
Density.
Yeah, when our internal operating system isn't clear, our perception of the outside world warps. This internal density is essentially a buildup of cognitive and emotional static. It's composed of unresolved patterns, conflicting beliefs we haven't examined, emotional residue and fragments of all those different maps we've collected but failed to integrate.
Oh, a great way to visualize this internal density is thinking about a computer's web browser. Imagine you have like 80 different tabs open at the same time. You've got news sites, email, a dozen different theoretical frameworks, old arguments playing on a loop.
Just eating up memory.
Exactly. All those open tabs are hogging the computer's RAM. The processing power is so overloaded with conflicting background data that when you try to load just one new simple web page, when you try to interpret the actual reality right in front of you, the entire system just freezes up.
That RAM overload is exactly what the text describes.
Yeah.
When you have that much internal density, you lose the ability to see clearly. Assumptions replace actual clarity. Constant comparison replaces genuine understanding.
You're just bogged down.
You are left in a very unstable, messy in-between state. You aren't fully conscious of the present moment, but you aren't completely unconscious either. You aren't integrated, but you also aren't released from the tension of all those conflicting maps.
It sounds like an exhausting way to live. I mean, human beings are deeply biologically uncomfortable in that state of fragmented limbo. We hate the anxiety of not having a clear answer.
We do. And because we despise that instability, human beings tend to react to this internal fragmentation in two common but equally disastrous ways.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first false solution the sources outline is imposition. This is the act of over-identifying with knowing. It manifests as forcing conclusions, over-defining reality, claiming absolute certainty prematurely, and imposing a fixed meaning onto a complex situation just to relieve the anxiety of the unknown.
Oh, wow. That is the person who reads half of an article about a psychological complex, and suddenly they are diagnosing their boss, their partner, and their parents with it.
Totally.
They are slamming down a rigid label because the actual nuanced complexity of those human relationships takes way too much emotional RAM to process. It's just easier to slap a sticker on it and call it a day.
Exactly. It creates a false sense of control. The other reaction is the complete opposite extreme, which is withdrawal. This is over-identifying with not knowing.
How does that work?
Instead of forcing meaning, you react to the fragmentation by rejecting meaning entirely. You avoid interpretation. You disconnect from structure altogether, adopting a stance that basically says, well, since no single scientific model or philosophy perfectly explains the universe, it's all fake. Nothing matters, and I'm not going to try to understand anything.
The ultimate nihilist approach. If the subway map doesn't show me the architecture, I'm going to burn the map and just wander in the dark.
Right. But both of these reactions, the rigid imposition of labels and the nihilistic withdrawal, are really just defense mechanisms against the pain of feeling fragmented.
Neither one actually solves the underlying problem.
No, they don't. The philosophical text argues that true coherence isn't choosing one defense mechanism over the other. True coherence is the ability to hold both realities simultaneously. It is the capacity for knowing without rigidity and not knowing without disconnection.
I feel like we just hit a wall there because that sounds like an impossible paradox. Knowing without rigidity and not knowing without disconnection. If picking a definitive label makes me a rigid tyrant, but ignoring all labels makes me a disconnected nihilist, I mean, I'm trapped. Is there a third option here? How do we actually find clarity without falling into either extreme?
The actual resolution presented across these sources requires a fundamental shift in how we treat our own minds. Clarity does not come from adding more and more sophisticated systems to your brain, hoping that eventually you'll collect enough maps to stitch together the entire territory.
Right.
Nor does it come from throwing all the maps in the trash.
Right.
Clarity comes exclusively from removing the internal interference. You have to close the 80 browser tabs.
You clear the overloaded RAM so the system can actually process what is right in front of it.
Exactly. When your internal system clears that dense buildup of emotional residue and rigid assumptions, perception becomes direct. Understanding becomes a natural flowing process rather than a forced intellectual exercise.
The connections just happen.
Yeah, the connections between different ideas or people appear on their own without you having to aggressively bridge them with a theory. You suddenly realize you don't need to brutally reduce reality into rigid categories just to feel safe in the world.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now, navigating a world that constantly demands you pick a label, pick a side, or adopt a framework? How does this practically change things?
It changes how we view every single analytical tool at our disposal. The text suggests a complete reframing of all systems. Whether you are dealing with economic forecasting, behavioral psychology, physics, or astrology, we need to view them merely as languages of patterns.
Not absolute truths.
Right. They are geometric symbolic mappings. They are tools meant to aid perception. They are never definitions of reality.
They describe tendencies. They highlight dynamics and relationships that can genuinely help us navigate a tricky situation. But they cannot and will never fully encapsulate a person's worth, the truth of a situation, or the depth of reality.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the manuscript lays out what it calls the unified truth beneath everything. Reality is inherently whole, it is deeply relational, and it is continuous. It is an unbroken stream.
And our systems.
Human systems are merely partial, low-resolution representations of that whole. Our focus creates a temporary separation, purely so our limited brains can perceive a tiny piece of the infinite.
So the anxiety, the information overload, the rigid societal arguments, all of that suffering comes from forgetting the unbroken whole and violently defending our tiny fragmented map.
Exactly. Think about how this plays out on social media. Mistaking the map for the territory is the exact mechanism behind almost every vicious online argument.
Oh, absolutely. You see a low-resolution avatar and a two-sentence opinion. That is a map. But people engage with it as if it is the entirety of a human being's soul. They argue with the map, completely blinded to the massive, complex, breathing human territory sitting behind the screen.
It's tragic, really. When you finally clear that internal interference, when you stop desperately needing a map to dictate who you are or what the universe means, coherence emerges naturally. You don't have to force the infinite complexity of life into tiny, easily digestible fragments just to make sense of your day.
You can just let reality be whole.
Yes, and you can use the maps when they are useful without letting them become your cage.
Which is such an incredibly freeing realization, because for you, listening right now, understanding this cognitive mechanism gives you immediate permission to stop forcing reality and yourself into neat little boxes.
Takes the pressure off.
Totally. Whether you are prepping for a highly technical strategic meeting at work, taking a new personality test, or trying to understand a complex political landscape, you don't have to carry the burden of making one single framework explain everything. You can put that heavy burden down.
The map is just a helpful tool in your hand. It is not the actual ground you are walking on.
It represents a fundamental evolution from trying to aggressively master reality to simply participating in it with a much clearer, more open vision.
I couldn't agree more.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final, lingering question to mull over. Think about everything we've unpacked today regarding how our brains filter the world.
Right.
If every single model we use, from our rigid personality labels to our advanced physics equations, requires us to temporarily blind ourselves to the rest of reality, what invisible parts of the world and what unseen parts of yourself might suddenly appear if you simply stopped trying to label them for just one day?
That's a profound thought.
It really is. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. It has been a profound journey through the architecture of our own minds, and we really hope it helps you see the world and the maps you use to navigate it just a little bit clearer. Until next time.